Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Legal Insight session on financial compliance risk management. We are going to be running through the specific governance standards and what your agency does need to be across in terms of reporting and meeting its specific requirements. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So let's have a look at what today's agenda is and what we're going to build on. I will just mention that last week we did review the cybersecurity standards. It is currently a big issue that many charities are still facing, and also now with the whole Optus review and quite damning reports we're seeing by the minister on the way in which Optus is handling this as portrayed in the media yesterday. A lot of charities are now taking this a lot more seriously in terms of the requirements that they do need to meet as well too. We will go back over this in terms of the risk management reporting, but today we are going to focus specifically on the financial obligations and actually have a look at what this means for your agency. That said, we did give you access to the governance standards and also the legal resources, which I will just bounce you into as well too to show you where those are. There were a number of questions that I will also cover off in terms of having a look at the past recordings and where to find these as well. So with this, certainly the legal resources that we do and have given you access to is under our governance risk and compliance dashboard. And you can access this by going to the Gemba 360 dashboard. You will also get copies of the recording in this afternoon, along with access to the updated resources as well. And once you get to the Gemba 360 login, you can use your email address. We will reset your password and you can access this. And this will take you into this site here. Where we will be ending up today is this risk register button. But just to recap, you do have access to the governance risk and legal compliance form, which you can access. This one here allows you to add an entry, and you'll be able to go through and have a look at the self-assessment tool as well too that you are able to view. That said, on the form itself, if we just bring this back in, then again, what you are able to see is essentially these resources, and one of those will be the risk register button that will appear on your dashboard following today's session. That said, with this, we do have to have a look at what the governance standards are and obviously what the obligations are that you need to meet as part of this. Now, as we have said over the past number of sessions, the governance standards essentially arise out of the ACNC governance requirements for not-for-profit and charitable agencies. That said, there are specific other requirements that you do need to follow, whether your agency is registered under the Office of Registrar for Indigenous Corporations, and that's really for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander corporations. You may also be registered under ASIC as well too, if you are, for example, a company limited by guarantee. What these do is provide a series of specific standards that your agency does need to meet. And in the past webinars, we have covered off what corporate governance is, what the obligations are that you need to meet within your agency. As saying that, there are a number of specific standards more broadly that the ACNC does expect you to meet. There are 6 in total, and we've covered these off in the past sessions. Standard 1 talks about purposes for not-for-profit in nature, accountability to members, compliance with Australian laws, suitability of responsible people, and duties of responsible people, as well as maintaining and enhancing public trust. Now, one of these is, if I just go back, is on the compliance with Australian laws. And some of the areas that we do cover off when we're looking at standards is not just what we call the standards themselves, but also what is the legislation that your agency does need to meet. Now, one of the areas that we have focused on is the governance areas for the ACNC. And there's 4 general areas. We've covered off cybersecurity in the past. Financial abuse is what we're looking at now. We will be looking at working with partners and safeguarding vulnerable people in the upcoming weeks throughout October. What we do find is that across this, there is the need for agencies or charities to understand what risk management is and to put what we call an assessment framework in place. Now, a lot of charities turn around and go, what does this mean and what is the scope that we need to look at from a legal compliance perspective? And it's a very good question, because you can get lost in all of this stuff very, very quickly. Now, what we have seen, and I will just jump into the standards and the legislation here, is that when we have looked at some of the financial standards, and we see this under the governance standards from the ACNC, and we do acknowledge that we are running these sessions. We're not part of any regulatory advisors or the likes with the ACNC, ISIC, but this does allow us to provide what we call our legal comment over the top of some of the recommendations that these regulators do ask you to meet. So when we look at the governance standards, and we've seen this if you go back to your legal resource, and let me just bring this up and step you through this, you will find that we've got the assessment tool, and you can click on this, and this will open up, and it has a list of the specific standard areas that you need to meet, and this is really your self-assessment checklist that you can use. What agencies are expected to do is to have a risk management process in place. Now, what does this mean and where does this come from as well too? So when we look at this, what we do look at is what is the legislation not only affecting your agency, but also what is the measures that the government also put in place as well too. Now, there are a number of different key legislations. One of these is the Pgpa, or Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act. And this is a Commonwealth Act that really applies to non-corporate Commonwealth entities, corporate entities, and Commonwealth companies as well. And the idea of this is on the public governance, performance and accountability rules to look at establishing requirements and procedures necessary to affect the governance, performance and accountability matters that are covered by the Pgpa Act. And this is under the current finance.gov.au website. You can have a look at it. I'm not showing you anything that is offline, so to speak, as well. It has a range of policies, legislation and guidelines, as well as instruments that you can see here. Of course, there are policy directions that need to be met as well too. So when we are looking at this, one of these things include assessments and how to use public funding. What is the expectation of government departments and how is this then managed? This also then looks at things like policy advice on things like disability care funds. It looks at how services should be delivered and what are the reporting measures that governments should be upheld. And there's flip charts of how it and who it affects and all kinds of different government agencies. That said, when we look at this, what we then pull is essentially the key legislation that you need to have within your own risk register. And what I mean by that essentially is this. Now, if I go into the financial abuse section under the governance standards, it talks about financial abuse is a term that covers a number of issues, including possible instances of bribery, corruption, financial fraud, improper use or misappropriation of community services funds, and it specifies quite clear requirements of what your agency should actually be looking at. And that really sets the framework for this. What we then see is essentially another question coming out of this, and this was a question that was asked last week in terms of where does the governance standards and service standards overlap. So what I mean by this is you might have your governance standards, and this is just what the regulators require you to manage to have your charity registered. And also, what is also here is separately the service standards that you also need to meet as well too. Now, let me bring up what I mean by this for us to have a closer look at. Now, on this, what we need to look at is for some agencies, and I've just used the MARAM framework as an example of this, you may well apply to, good question. Thank you, Michelle. Michelle has said, do the service standards apply to everyone, or is it just if receiving government funding? That's a great question. So essentially, if you are receiving government funding, then essentially what you will have is different service standards that you may well need to meet. This is just an example of one of those. And essentially from here, this is for an agency that receives funding under those particular requirements. So what we are able to see from here is this. What we can see is the specific requirements that you are able to actually meet on this, and I'm just bringing this up for you. So let's have a look, because there will be different legislation that does actually apply. So when we go into the risk register, what you do need to look at is your governance standards to start off with, and as Michelle points out, this will essentially be what you're actually registered to maintain your registration as a charity. And a sample of what one looks like is essentially found under your risk register. And this is one here, and you will have access to be able to view this. Now, if I click on this, this is just a sample being on our demo site of what we have. So essentially what we have kept here is you'll see that we've got the ACNC registration as a charity. We've marked this in, and we've got a number of these locked in here. And then we've got another one called Service Risks and Compliance with MARAM. Now, essentially, this is something that a lot of agencies do use. They've actually gone through their registration process, and in terms of what works and what doesn't, essentially what I'll say, it's really a minimum requirement under the ISO standards that for risk register reporting. So let's have a look at just one or two of these. I'll work through what the operational performance is as a registered charity, and then we'll look at what a service standard look one is and why we've designed it in that way. So essentially what we've opened up and taken is the individual standards, and you'll find this within your dashboard. So essentially what we have here is divided up into a number of sections: risk identification, risk analysis, risk treatment, and monitoring reviews. So essentially what we've pulled is all of your individual governance risk reporting standards. So this is kind of the line in the sand of what your minimum requirements you should be able to show. Now on this, what we have is to understand its charitable purposes and ensures all activities and funding are directed towards these purposes. Now, quite simply, and I'm going to add to this as well too, how does your agency actually show this? We've marked in that essentially the process is that you get this reviewed by your board directors annually, and your current controls is that you've conducted the risk assessment. You might have a policy that you also use that shows of how your services are performed, and somebody else has just pointed out, well, importantly, the other document that you probably will also use is this one is your current company, and I'll put in here, and company rule book or constitution document that your company or charity utilizes. And this shows that essentially you've got your funding, it's got your directions and what your controls are, and this is reviewed by your board annually. Now, we scroll down and we've just said, what's the objective out of this? Well, the objective out of this is to meet your ACNC obligations. We've just marked in here that it's reviewed annually by your board, and we've set the next review dates for you. Now, once this is done, you'll get this updated, and you can simply go in, and you might want to actually change this to next year to review it. And you can simply do that directly by going, look, well, we'll actually mark this for review in 12 months' time. Might make this the 1st of October. I'm then going to do the same thing for my next one as well too. Let's make this the 13th, and then I'll do it for the end of November, and we'll review this to make sure that we've actually done this as well. So you can then save this form directly, and that's done. What you're able to do on here is essentially run your board reports directly. And the idea of this is that as you go through, if you needed to, you can simply run your board reports. Let's say I'm going to run my reports from here. I want to generate a quick board report for this month's board meeting. And you can see right now that now I've got my board report ready. It's got my list of activities. It's got my list of actions as well too that I need to do. So very, very quickly, I can see exactly what we need to do at any point in time. Now, one of the other questions that did come up was around service standards and where do these apply? Now, if I go back to my own slides, here we are here, what we see is that the governance standards is one section. If you do have specific service standards around, let's say, domestic violence, or it might be other community common care standards or the like, or the National Safety and Quality Council standards as well, those can then be added in here, and you can click on add and those will be added in for you. Now, let's have a look at one of the service standards for you. And then I've just loaded one of these in. Now, where did this information come from, and how and why is it actually relevant to what we're doing? Now, what we in fact did was look at the specific service standards. You can see it's here. It shows what the specific, in this case, funding requirements are and what your obligations are to meet your governance, risk, and financial reporting. And you can see we've got Pillar 1, Pillar 2, Pillar 3, Pillar 4 examples listed on this particular one. Now, what we have done is simply take each of those and load those in. So we've got the list of impact, we've got the compliance standards, we've got the obligation, what the risk process is, what your current controls are as well too. And this particular section has been lifted directly from this service standard section here, and also then rated the risk of what's there. Now, again, the rating of the risk is subjective to your agency. Now, as part of that, we've just marked it as low, but if it is high, then you've obviously got to show what you've actually done to minimize this risk and complete this. And again, once you've done that, you can save the form and that'll be actioned for you. So the idea of these financial assessment tool and this risk register is to be able to show what you've done and when. Now, there are a whole bunch of other things I won't go into too much, but just to say every time you make the changes, there'll be archive logs to show what you've been done and who's done what and when. So the idea is that you've got your generated board reports that you can view at any point in time. It also means that as part of your risk register, you've got your organizational risks all in one spot, and you're able to view these as required directly with your specific agencies. Now, one of the things we will be looking at, and we will be more than happy to make time with each of you over the next couple of weeks, is to go through this with you directly. There will be a lot of things that we will be updating specifically when we're looking at other specific standards that your agency needs to meet. And in upcoming weeks, this will include working with partners and also other obligations like safeguarding vulnerable people as well too. If you are watching this recording after today's live session, we do recommend that you go through, have a look at the self-assessment, have a look at the legal templates, especially the risk register. If you have any questions, do reach out to us. We will be continuing this risk register and reporting next week and showing you how to meet all of your governance standards. If you do have any questions, by all means, please stay on the line. More than happy to answer any questions that you might have. If you are watching this recording after today's live session and do have any questions, please reach out to us on 1300 360 360, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com.